Welcome to the Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist of Liger Partners, and I speak to others about what it takes to lead and manage a business. And today I have a very interesting person who's in that category, Jesan Sorrells. He's with Leadership Toolkit. So, Leadership Toolkit, tell me a little bit about what you guys do.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on the Claw. I appreciate it. I love what you're doing. I'm here on the Liger podcast, and I'm glad to be here today. Um, so what we do here at Leadership Toolbox, what we do here is we actually help managers and supervisors become better leaders. One of the biggest challenges of our time is leadership, and quite frankly, we believe that people who are operating and people who are running and people who are leading small and medium-sized businesses, they're doing some of the most impactful leadership work today. And we have designed our products and tools and services to be able to help them become better leaders. Everything from conflict management all the way to adapting to change. And love to come on. Love to be here, not come on, but I love to be here and be talking about this, particularly in a B2B context where very often the human parts of the B2B context sometimes get left behind.
Yeah, and you and I talked a couple weeks ago. I do a thing called Lunch Club, which is kind of an interesting way to get to meet people. And so we were talking a few weeks ago about the fact that in the Liger portfolio, we work with a lot of M&A. So a lot of companies where they're out buying another company and they're trying to figure out, how to bring those cultures together. And so when you get into those situations, having leadership that knows how to manage these parts of it is really important because if, the cultures don't match, the business doesn't match, right? So might look good on paper, but not necessarily behind the scenes. So, so when you run into one of those situations where they're going to bring two companies together, so you got two companies they're going to merge, and when you say merge, really one becomes the alpha and one becomes the beta. Like there's never really a true merger of those two cultures. So, what are some of the things that you guys look at or advise companies on when they're in that kind of stage?
Yeah, mergers and acquisitions, M&A, acquiring or merging, depending upon which side of the equation you want to frame this on, is fraught with danger. And what is mostly looked at is how does this look on paper? And if it matches on paper, it'll be great, right? This will all somehow magically work out, right? Um, and I'm opposed to all forms, and our firm is opposed to all forms of magical thinking. You can actually click that.
Well, we tell people that we're the marketing department, and if you're looking for the magic department, they're down the hall. We're in alphabetical order, right? So like magic and then marketing. Yeah.
That's right. We don't live in the world of Harry Potter, and unfortunately, the magic wand shop is closed if it was ever open in the first place. Look, mergers and acquisitions work or don't work because of people, fundamentally, at the end of the day. I don't really care about your numbers. I don't really care about the bottom line. Those things are interesting, but they're not particularly relevant. The most relevant thing is culture. And so, what we look at is, can these cultures mesh? Do we have managers and supervisors that are on the same page? Not merely mouthing it with their words or with their mouths, right? But actually doing it in their actions. And if they're not, what you're going to find, and this is what you find almost all the time, is that the mid-level managers of whichever company it is wind up either taking a payout and leaving or just outright quitting and going to other places where they are a better cultural fit. Then usually the acquiring company has to rehire to rebuild that culture, and it winds up costing them 2 to 3 times more than it would have if they looked at that before they did the merger and took it as seriously as they should have before they did the merger rather than after.
Wow. And so that seems like a really hard thing to do, right? Because culture is one of the, everybody's like, culture eats strategy for breakfast and la, la, la. But culture is this like definition of, if I asked you what does happy mean, what is your definition of being happy? Your definition of being happy would be very different from mine. Or if I asked you skiing, you might think about snow skiing and I might think about water skiing. Like we both think we're talking about the same thing, but we're not. So when you end up in those situations where you're evaluating a company's culture and determining it to be good or bad, if there's such a thing, what are some of the tools and approaches that you use to look at that?
Sure. So, at a practical level, look, assessments, questions, interviewing, those are the kinds of tools that you can use. This isn't rocket science, right? You can also use and leverage consultants that are in the space of like I am, conflict management, negotiation, coaching, even. But you have to listen to those people and actually believe them. And that's the thing,
And
right?
people lie all the time.
People lie all the time, and on the other end, people want outcomes because of confirmation bias so badly that when they are pressured by other factors and other forces that are around that confirmation bias, they move in the direction that allows a particular decision to be made. Now, back to your point about culture, Peter Drucker had it correct. But unfortunately, when you go to an executive who is either in the acquiring company or the company that is being merged with the other company, or organization or team or whatever, most of the time, those executives, when you ask them, what is the culture of this team? What is the culture of this organization? What is the culture of, you know, the people that you are leading? They will stare at you blankly and they will say, I don't know what that means. That is a fundamental failure of leadership. Leadership is the thing that creates culture. It help or at least helps create culture. And culture is one of those things that, just like air, if you don't have it, you know you don't have it.
Okay, so I got a couple things I want to unpack there. So you talk about confirmation bias. So you said a desire to you said something really smart, like desire to lean into confirmation bias.
Yes, the desire to lean into confirmation bias.
So
So
tell me what is confirmation bias?
sure. So confirmation bias is this psychological idea that I will look for things that agree with my position and I will run away from things that basically put my decision in jeopardy because I don't want my ego, I don't want my intellect, I don't want to look embarrassed in front of my friends, there's social pressure, whatever, right? That's confirmation bias.
Got it. Okay. All right. That's good. So if someone has an opposing view, then you're gonna find other people like your clicks maybe based on the people who feel and sound much like you and what it will look like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so then if you say that most leaders when you stare at them and they say they can't define culture, what give me an example of a company or like give me an example of a company defining culture well. Like, it feels like, it's like one of those things, like because 'cause I love words, and so you almost always feel like you're falling short, when you're trying to define something really important. It's like, "Oh, I gotta define love." Like, how do you define that, right? So, like, defining culture feels like one of those really lofty things that I have to be able to say great words about, and you do run into because I work with companies to try to define what they are so we can put branding on top of that. Because really the branding needs to represent what you are, not, you can be aspirational, but just a lot harder. Like, what are you really? And let's build the brand around what you really are. So how do you what's a good definition of culture? What company have you heard do it well?
Yeah, so better than giving a good definition of culture because there's multiple different businesses in multiple different spaces, multiple different verticals. They're going to define this differently. When the executive who's in charge of defining it finally clicks on and goes from having a blank stare to, oh, I know what this is. So let's use a practical example of a company with what I consider to be a very practical culture, and
Okay.
I'm using that term on purpose. The company Basecamp out of Chicago. So
Yeah.
they create project management software, right? They were founded by Jason Fried and Dylan Heimar Hansen, who also created Ruby on Rails, right? And if you recall, a couple of years ago, they kind of blew up, to use that term on Twitter, basically for saying something and for writing something out loud that many people in Silicon Valley found to be quite frankly, offensive, right? And they actually said, and by the way, this was a through line. This was part of a natural through line of their culture, right? They said, at our organization, we will not talk about politics or religion at work. This isn't worth talking about. Now that gets into a whole bunch of other different things. And by the way, you can go check out the tweets. You can go look at the blog post. You can see what happened to DHH and what happened to Jason Fried and how they all blew up. And a bunch of people quit and they're fine.
Right.
That's their culture.
Yeah.
Another example of culture that I use very often is the company Red Bull. Red Bull was founded in Germany, right? And during the 2020, 2021 Black Lives Matter riots or protests, however you want to frame it, during this cultural and identity chaos that was occurring in the United States for your international listeners, that was occurring in the United States. Red Bull as a company basically said, we sell an energy drink. We don't care about identity politics. And
Yeah.
they actually fired their head of their vice president of diversity, and they shut down that entire department. Now, say what you want about that. And by the way, everybody's going to have an opinion, just like with Basecamp. That is an example of what culture is at Red Bull. They're
Yeah.
stating something about who they are. That is an example of what culture is at Basecamp. They're stating something about who they are. Or I'm going to go a little bit further back into the past, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Amazon very briefly. Jeff Bezos very often said, if you want bean bags and sleep pods, you can go work at Google across the street. Don't come work at Amazon. That's not what we've got going on here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, like he's like, if you don't want to come into the office and you don't want this, whatever, then I will accept that as your resignation. Right. Like that was basically the way he said it. So
Exactly. And people get all upset about this, but we live in a world right now.
are you in or out? Right.
Are you in or out?
Right.
Polarization seems to create anxiety, but actually, what polarization does is it actually releases anxiety because people can make clear choices about where they want to put their labor, their time, and most importantly, their attention.
Yeah, and that's such a funny thing is I love that thread because there's this whole conversation about, people just want to be free and they want their whatever. People really like boundaries.
They really
They
do.
love rules. Yeah, what's this? What's that? When you're like, oh, you can just do whatever, whenever, da da da. And it's like, no, literally, I need you to do this at this point. And they're much more comfortable in that kind of category, much more successful.
That's right.
And it feels anti, like people are like, oh no, but you should just let people be. And it's like, no, you really need to like give them some accountability and a goal and a thing to go after and some guardrails to do it. And then they really have freedom because they can stay within those things to get what they want done. So yeah.
Well, and the marketer and educator Seth Godin, who I know you're very familiar with, and probably many of your listeners are, has often said that the internet, not social media, but the internet created microcultures. And we all came out of the 20th century that was mass culture. Johnny Carson pulling 60 million viewers a night, only 3 channels on television. Many of us are still alive who can either remember the end of that historical epic or were in that historical epic where we're transitioning, and we have been, by the way, for about 25 years, away from that. And we're transitioning into smaller and smaller microcultures on a longer and longer long tail. And if you don't know what the long tail is, you can go take a look at that on Wikipedia. But on a longer and longer tail, where we have to have clear and clear definitions of what we are and what we aren't. So, to pull this back to mergers and acquisitions, if you are merging with a company, you need to see just how clearly their executives have defined culture for that company. Are they doing it as a marketing scheme where they're changing a few things on social media and they're putting out a few ads? Or are they treating their employees in a particular way? Are they engaging with them in a particular way around work? Are they engaging with them in a particular way around perks? Are they engaging with them in a particular way around meetings? We're having this right now with the remote work revolution that's going on. Companies are being forced, against their will, most of them, to change their culture around thinking about remote work. Because pre-COVID, we went from somewhat, what was it, less than 1 to 2% of white collar workers work from home to at the height of COVID, something like 60% of white collar workers are working from home. Uh, to paraphrase a little bit from Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Because we should.
you might want to choose wisely.
Right. Yeah.
In thinking about that, merging companies and acquiring companies need to be asking these questions on both sides of the equation. How do you treat your workers? How many meetings do you have? These are practical questions that you can ask to assess what the culture is and to clearly define it.
Very cool. So I'm going to mention one book before we go to the break, and then I want to come back and talk about like I find out that I'm in my company's been bought. Like, what do I do first? If I'm in the management level, what's the first thing I do? Don't answer that question. We'll talk about it after the break. But there's a book that reminded me of what you talked about earlier that came out in the 90s called The Fourth Turning.
Mhm.
And that fourth turning talks about the microcosms that you're talking about. So, like, used to in the 60s and 70s, I would play golf with my neighbor. Like my neighbor and I both play golf. We get together, blah, blah. Now I may play golf with somebody across the the city because we're friends in some other reason. I found them online, whatever, and then we meet up at the golf course. So you make these. Your neighborhood used to be your microcosm, and now it's like however you decide to establish those networks, which is just a very different way, and also makes it harder to target those people from a marketing perspective. But yeah. All right, well, cool. We're gonna go to a commercial break, and when we get back, I want to talk about like, hey, so I find out that I'm a marketing person in a company. I've been managing my department, and it just got bought. What do I do first? What does that look like? So, we're talking today with Jesan Sorrells. He's with Leadership Toolbox. You're listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger, and we'll be back in just a minute.
The Claw podcast is brought to you by Liger Partners. Liger Partners is a premier marketing firm where we save the world from boring, broken marketing. We get underdogs recognition because you deserve it. For more information, go to ligerpartners.com and follow us on all social media platforms at Liger Partners.
And you're listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger, and I'm talking today with Jesan Sorrells. He is with Leadership Toolbox. And we're talking about M&A and culture and how do you make it through all those kind of things. And so before we went to the commercial break, we work with about 90 to 95% of our portfolio are companies that have bought other companies. Occasionally, we've got one right now that just got bought. So they're kind of going through the process of rebranding. So I'm managing the marketing department inside my company. And then, the CEO comes in tomorrow and it's like, hey, guess what? We've been bought. And that company has like a marketing department too. What are some of the first steps I should take? So like, do I bribe the CEO?
One of the first things that you do after you consider bribery or quitting, and by the way, you should fully consider both of those options. That's okay. And probably you won't go in the direction of quitting because you probably don't have your resume punched up and you probably weren't expecting that. So that's probably not realistic. And bribery, as I joke with my children sometimes, will get you everywhere, but maybe not at work.
At least for a little while, right? Yeah.
That's for a little while, right? But it's one of those tactics that has declining returns over the course of time. What you see, in all seriousness, what you have to do in that situation is you have to look your supervisor, your boss in the face, and you have to say, listen, they have a marketing department. Is their marketing department doing what we do, or are they doing something radically different? And I need a truthful, honest assessment here. Now, hopefully you've built up enough social and political capital, small p, not Republican or Democrat, this is not that, don't be confused,
Right.
Enough political capital with your boss over the course of time to be able to get a truthful answer to that question, because your boss is probably wondering that as well, or seeking to get an answer to that question. If you haven't built up that capital, however, one of the very tactical, practical things I say is you need to start making friends. You need to start creating alliances and getting allies, because number one, you're all going to have to stick together. That's the first thing. You're going to have to negotiate as a group, but you can't negotiate with a group if you don't know what you're negotiating with or for or even against. And you are in a negotiating position. As a matter of fact, it's not just the marketing department, it's operations, it's human resources, it's product, it's the entire line, right? The entire supply chain of the company is now in a negotiation footing, and we have to negotiate together. Now, this is very difficult, and you pointed out the fourth turning, and I talked a little bit about Seth Godin. There's a book that was written 25 years ago called Bowling Alone, which talks about the decline of social links between people. Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance talked about this in a blue collar sense. Throughout our society in the United States, because of the atomization of mass culture, we now don't feel as united to others as we used to. We don't feel that sense of solidarity, that sense of togetherness. We talked a little bit about it during COVID, but in reality, we were all inside of our houses. So It was really hard to be together, right? And by the way, organizations know this. Now, I'm not saying that they're knowing this from a sense of maliciousness or destruction. I'm just saying they sense it in the same way that we do, but they come to different conclusions based on that sense, right? So if you're in that marketing department, let me get practical with you. Band together with other folks in your marketing department, get allies, and begin to create alliances and figure out how you can negotiate together. This is very practical. Also talk to your boss and talk to your supervisor and ask for a real world assessment of what's going on in that other company. If you can't get transparency on that, by the way, that should be a red flag to you, because there should be transparency. They should have nothing to hide. They should be opening up the doors and releasing all of the keys to let you look under the hood. You wouldn't buy a car without looking at the engine.
Right.
You wouldn't buy a house without going on a tour of it.
Right.
Why would you agree to be inside of a merger or inside of an acquisition without looking under the hood first?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what's interesting for us is we see marketing, because marketing is such a broad topic now. It goes across some, and they get thrown everything, right? Like if somebody doesn't know where to go, it's like, oh, we need to do an internal communications. Let's give that to marketing. Oh, we need to do, oh, let's give that to marketing. So identifying that you're in a really good position to ask good questions and because you can use, hey, to do my job effectively, I really need to know, what does the other business do? How does it work? So where product and product might need to align, those two, it's one product team. Marketing has maybe the most broad charter to go through and be like, hey, so who are these people at this new company and how do they mesh and meld? And how do we make our message the same, So I see it as it's a good position to be in when that happens, because you can ask the questions, you can figure out what that is, where in some cases you're very siloed. Like if you're in the accounting department and they have an accounting department, well, you don't really have the charter to go off and start asking everybody what they do, but you just have to determine, are these two accounting departments going to stand? Probably unlikely. That's one of those redundancies they typically get rid of. Yeah, but yeah. So.
Well, the other thing is you have a dynamic in marketing where you can drive internal culture. So it's more than just the externalities, right? And too many I have seen in my time, and your mileage will probably vary on this, but I have seen in my time many marketing departments that are so externally focused on making the brand look good to the public that they miss the golden opportunity internally to drive the internal communications process. And they miss that mandate at their peril when a merger or an acquisition, quite frankly, comes along.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the marketing has this really interesting charter from, cradle to grave for the customer, for the employee, such a broad chapter. So I have a question for you that is just a strange one because I'm sitting here talking to you. You have a poster behind you that says, "No, you can't." Tell me about that poster, because it's dry. Because
I love the movie Megamind. My kids know I love the movie Megamind, and so it's the villain's poster from Megamind when he's in the city and he's running through, and all of the after he's taken over the city, and all the posters are sort of a mock on the Barack Obama "Yes, you can" idea. And it says, "No, you can't." And he's like running by. And so the story behind this is my kids who struggle with trying to figure out what to get me for Christmas presents, because I'm that annoying dad who can just go out and get whatever I want.
Yeah. Everyone hates me for that reason too. They tell me in November, they're like, "Stop buying things for yourself. Just tell me what it is you want." Yeah.
That's right. Or I don't need anything because I already have everything. And so what do I don't need more. I'm not interested in acquiring, more stuff just for the sake of stuff. Right. And so my daughter, who was, I think she was 11 at the time, we were watching the movie or whatever, and she asked me, "What do you want for Christmas?" And I paused the movie and I looked at the poster. I pointed at the poster of the movie. I said, "If you could find me that would be clever, and it shouldn't cost you any more than $15." So she goes, "Okay, well, young lady after my own heart." Anyway, so we finished watching the rest of the movie. I totally completely forgot about it because I was kind of goofing or whatever. And Christmas Day, there's this tube, and they hand it to me. And they go, "You're going to love this," and I unroll it, and there it is. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that movie. I think it's so much of it's such a hero's journey story, but with a villain that can only be done in a time such as ours.
So, but do you look at it every morning and you're like, "Yeah, I can"? Like, is that what you're doing? Yeah.
Yeah, actually I can. Yeah, actually I can. No, it's wrong. Yeah, actually I can. And of course it's a nice talking piece to sit in my background. And you can't see it, but the other sign above me is the one from the U.S. Space Center. And I'm a huge fan of Star Trek and Star Wars. I'm not going to get into all that, but I'm a huge fan of all of that, and so failure is not an option. I'm a huge fan of the space
Well, that
program.
one makes sense. Like the no, you can't one, and I was like, well, that does make sense because surviving an M&A thing, becoming a good leader, is really about leaning into diversity and being
It
like,
is.
screw you, I'll show you, right?
That's
Like
right.
we're gonna make it through. You just can't quit. Like it's a hunt. Got to keep going. Got to get up every day. Find that. And if you can't find that, that's something you got to tap into. Like that's really what
Mhm.
makes the difference. And it's the you have victim or survivor
That's right.
mentality. It's like you're either a victim of things or you're a survivor of it. And if you
That's
if you
right.
can just switch your language from a victim to survivor, and it happened for a reason, and makes you
That's
like
right.
more powerful moving forward, right? So like that M&A, like, oh my gosh, my company got bought. It's like, well, no, that could be an opportunity, right?
Right. Every cloud has a silver lining, or every silver lining has a cloud, depending upon your depending upon your angle
Yeah,
angle on that.
yeah,
Um, but I think also that, and this ties back into something that I was saying a little bit earlier, or something that we were saying before the break, a little bit earlier about, how do you navigate not only the M&A space, but how do you navigate culture? Um, it is now down to us as individuals to figure that out, and
yeah,
that's really, ooh, that's really scary, right? And that's why, systems and processes like family, community, um, small c church, just meaning community, existed during the 20th century and were so powerful. And as those have broken up, even workplaces, as those have broken up and atomized, it's become more and more incumbent on the individual to make those types of decisions and to figure out where they're going to position themselves. This is where you get into personal branding, the kinds of things that uh, folks like, well, anyway, folks in the personal branding space talk about. I'm not going to name any names.
yeah. Well, and I love that because like if you think about it, so you had community and church and neighborhoods and whatever, and the office, for lack of a better, until the pandemic, was one of the last bastions of places
That's
that
right.
people came together in that way. And even if you go out, like I love to go out to eat, but you go to a restaurant, you're not like talking to any of the people there. You just happen to be in a room with a bunch of other people doing the same thing, right?
That's right.
So to survive in a business, which is something that I do, I'm going to sound like a really old guy, right? You know, I'm thinking about these younger kids, coming in is, you don't have the water cooler or going to lunch with your boss or whatever, because you may just be remote. And so how do you build that political capital, lowercase p? How do you make yourself visible? How do you build like that culture internally to then, go somewhere in that company and make sure they're communicating? It's a really interesting, model we're looking at right now. So yeah.
It is. It is. And, I'll sort of trip to it. I mean, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm part of the tail end of the generation that really had the wars with the baby boomers. And now we're going to kind of sit back a little bit for the next probably 15 years and rake in the benefit of all of that.
Right.
The formerly referred to as the sandwich generation, right? Um, Finally coming into our own, is the great geopolitician, or not geopolitician, but geopolitical commentator Peter Zehan talks about, right? But for the millennials, for those who are in that, eight and Gen Zers coming in, the 18 to 35 group, who are like, who right now, metaphorically as a group, are sort of bashing their heads against the wall and not going anywhere, or feeling as though they're not going anywhere. The reality in the United States is that demographically, there's more of you than there were the baby boomers. So cool out, chill out.
Right.
This is my big message for those of you who are chill out. It's okay.
Yeah.
You're going to win the argument at the end because there's just more of you.
You'll be in charge. You'll get to be in charge. Yeah.
Like, who else are we going to give it to? Like, really, at the
Right.
end of the day.
Yeah.
So the thing to do, and this is how sometimes when I'm doing leadership coaching, particularly for younger leaders, I tell them, get as much information as you can, and quite frankly, gather as much wisdom. And that's a key word that I think we've missed over the course of our time. We've confused knowledge that we can get on Google with actually hard-learned, hard-won wisdom that we cannot get from a search engine.
Yes.
Chat GPT is not going to give you wisdom.
You can't discern the answer, right? It doesn't discern the answer for you. Yeah, absolutely. And I call it book smart versus street smart. And I don't know, you may have an MBA, so I'm going to say this and I may offend you and I don't mean it, but I often won't hire an MBA because they've been taught not to be risky.
Right.
They've
Yeah.
been
No, I don't have
taught,
an MBA, but I used to teach MBAs.
yeah, they're taught this, that the spreadsheet doesn't tell you that not have them working for me in an entrepreneurial business. And I'm like, I don't care if the spreadsheet doesn't work. My gut tells me we're going to do this. We're going to go do this. Right. And there's just no replacement for that. You got to get out there and like get those pieces. So yeah.
That's right. You have to hit your feet have to hit the pavement. You have to shake the hands. You have to kiss the babies. I mean, we see this in sales, right?
Yeah.
It would be great if everyone bought things because of Facebook ads,
But they don't.
but they don't. Like it's one touch
Yeah.
out of multiple touches, right? That have to occur. And the final touch, by the way, and this is why I'm not really worried about artificial general intelligence in any real kind of way. The final touch will always be human to human.
Yeah.
We human beings still like buying, they like persuading, they like following people and leading, quite frankly, people who are people. They enjoy that. This is what we are built for.
Well, and I was having this conversation with the guy just even today about, artificial intelligence doesn't have feelings. It doesn't, it doesn't try to create a family. Like there's all these things that we do as humans that those things will inform, but it's just a different thing. So, well, very interesting conversation. We're at the end of our time. So it was great talking with you today. So I've been talking today with Jesan Sorrells. He's with Leadership Toolkit. I appreciate you listening into The Claw. I'm Eric Holtz-Claw, Chief Strategist at Liger. And until next time.